On this edition of India's World, we will take a closer look at the internal problems of Afghanistan and what it means for the region and the world. Joining me on the program today are Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, Professor Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, OP Jindal University, and Rana Banerjee, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Of course, the Taliban problem persists. Taliban is a major issue in Afghanistan, Professor, but then you have the issue of the Islamic State as well, where they go out, carry out attacks, kill innocent students, innocent children. How do you deal with such kind of a problem? They're trying to engage with the Taliban, but what do you do with a rogue group like the Islamic State?
Frank, the ISIS has never been amenable to negotiations because it's a very, very extreme hardline, ideology. And I think the anti-Shia violence, especially, is troubling because in the past there have been instances where, for example, the Hazara community, which is one of the important ethnic groups, which has a Shia majority, they used to be attacked, but it was not primarily because of by virtue of being Shia. But now the number of mosques and civilian targets the ISIS has been taking out. Initially, I think the big blunder that many governments have made is to underestimate ISIS and to say no, this is a Syrian or an Iraqi thing, and we don't have an ISIS here at home. And this is simply some splinter group of Taliban masquerading as ISIS. But what that does is it gives them, the Americans carried out some bombing campaign in Nangarhar in the east, saying that this is the ISIS headquarters and now we finished it. But then you have attacks in Kabul, you have attacks in Faryab, you have attacks in Herat in the west. So these are traditionally, supposed to be areas where Taliban or some other ethnic, warlords have been controlled. So where is ISIS coming from suddenly? And the ideology is distinct, right? I mean, they also want a so-called Sharia rule state, but something that will be far more diabolic than even what Taliban want. So I think this is complex civil wars that drag out for a long time. What happens is, even if one faction is willing to go for a peace talks and maybe a negotiated settlement, something that is spawned out of it continues to resist, and then you have a new generation of these mujahideen that continue to fight. So
does that mean peace is a far cry?
It is difficult because initially the Taliban seemed to be in control of the insurgent space, and now you have this new force that sometimes even clashes with Taliban in many parts of their country for turf war. So and it's not clear that the Pakistanis, which usually have been directing the Taliban from Quetta and from the ISI, that they have any control over the ISIS groups either. So in this situation, ISIS, is not really a classic state-sponsored terrorist group. It is inspired by, what is happening in the Middle East, and what they consider to be some kind of a global purification campaign against apostates within Islam. So I think you look at the way they have just recently attacked, where young students were doing tuition. I mean, the brutality, the sheer, and Taliban, by the way, are trying to clean up their image little bit because they are interested in power sharing, it seems. That's why there is at least some talks going on. But ISIS is not interested in any power sharing. I think their logic is we either rule completely or we, keep on killing. And so I think now we are in a situation where all the countries in the region have to take it in. The Russians have been saying for a long time that there is an ISIS problem and we need to think about it. And therefore, I think we need to look at a possible configuration where there are some elements of Taliban interested in peace, Afghan state which is tottering because of internal, internecine feuds among politicians and poor governance. I mean, look at the Gardes, the Ghazni situation. I mean, the police and the military are asking desperately for reinforcements from Kabul. Defense Ministry is saying we are sending them in 1 hour, 2 hours, nothing turns up, and people are being held up as sacrificial lambs. The same thing happened in Kunduz also. So the weakness of the Afghan state is allowing, and the paralysis of governance and the factional infighting is what is creating the space for ISIS or for newer groups to keep on coming up and continuing this war endlessly.
Professor, as far as the region is concerned, how important is it to have a peaceful Afghanistan for the region?
Frank, it cannot be overestimated. The Pakistanis just have elected a new prime minister, and the battle for Ghazni that just happened, according to the Afghan government, out of 400, 500 Taliban who have been killed, 70 or more were Pakistani citizens. And the Afghan intelligence says that Lashkar-e-Taiba, which has often been a thorn in the flesh for us in India, had actually sent fighters alongside the Taliban to raid Ghazni. And if you see especially the eastern part of Afghanistan that borders the tribal regions of Pakistan, is where it's the Durand line is porous and the militants keep moving with the ISI supply chain. And so you can see that for the region, and Imran Khan, the new prime minister, is going to be so weak because he himself beholden to the military and the ISI that he will deny that they have any hand in this problem. So in a way, it's going to be continuation of the same old game. So Pakistan destabilizes Afghanistan for its so-called strategic depth or other reasons, and in return, the Afghan problem comes back to haunt Pakistan because there are militants moving in both directions. And Pakistan will remain in the grip of extremism and violence. So second thing, Chechens, Uzbeks, all kinds of fighters are now again in a way returning to Afghanistan because the war in Syria and Iraq, as you know, have wound down. A lot of these former ISIS or other Mujahideen groups, some of whom who come from Central Asia, are returning. And now you have a situation, some of them are going to want to come back and regain their foothold in Afghanistan, either with ISIS or some faction of Taliban. So now you have a situation where the entire region is again at risk. I mean, Tajikistan, there is an ISIS branch that has recently announced itself by killing foreigners. So always the externalities of Afghanistan have been felt around, it's reverberated. And now it's really a matter of, we often talk about regional solutions. The Chinese should be involved, the Pakistanis should behave and restrain themselves. The Americans have played a double game. They're not really interested in fortifying the Afghan state fully. For example, they have not given them a proper air force to defend themselves. They're reliant on the Americans. And so we keep saying the regional solution. But I think we have now reached such a bit of a crisis point that if we don't actually create some kind of a regional conference mechanism, there is a Heart of Asia mechanism to stabilize Afghanistan. It meets once a year, but it's at a ministerial level. We have never really gone beyond talking in the Heart of Asia process to come up with a formula for regional stabilization. But if it will be too late, because right now they are saying 56% of the Afghan territory is only controlled by the Afghan state. That itself may be, I think, an exaggeration, because once you move out of the highways and the urban centers, they don't have control.
Right.
So it's dwindling and it is crumbling, and it is high time before it collapses, or recedes into complete, like just controlling Kabul and nothing else. We need to come up with some kind of a regional force to do something. India is averse to boots on the ground. We are risk averse, and that's understandable. We have paid a price for it in the past. But I think now we need to come up with some kind of a regional grouping, both diplomatic as well as military. Otherwise, the game is going to be lost. Civilian capacity also. You see, unlike the Europeans who have often taken on these things, I think we have greater ability to understand the problems of developing countries, because governance failure is at the core of a lot of these problems in Afghanistan. And when in our university, for example, we have trained dozens of Afghan civil servants, and they always complain about the political bosses, the ethnic manipulation and the division, the warlordism, and how Dostum doesn't work with Ghani, Ghani doesn't work with Abdullah, and how the whole thing is a mess. But the question is, what can they at the lower level of administration do to solve basic problems of justice and public works that people need? Because of the lack of those, people are turning to Taliban, people are turning to ISIS, young people have no opportunities. India, as a developmental state and as a democracy, which is also a relatively poor country, we can impart a lot of the training and skill transfer that is needed at the intermediate and lower levels of the Afghan state. So state building, especially at the political level and the administrative level, we should take on as a great mission, because the military itself will be insufficient to hold on to the territorial gains that whatever the Afghan National Army does.
All right, very well summed up by all the panelists. Thank you to all of you for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.